and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. It's my pleasure today to be talking to you about the one and only Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin. If you like this video, be sure to also check out my video series on Gershwin's Concerto in F. I did a series of 3 videos covering the form and structure and analysis of that piece. You can find that on my Gershwin playlist. Unlike with that work, in which Gershwin was intentionally trying to be as structurally cohesive as he possibly could, and he succeeded very wonderfully, here Gershwin also succeeds at making a piece that works really well and flows really well, but it was probably mainly due to his superb musical instincts that this happened. Rhapsody in Blue is a famously loosely held together piece, but it always carries the day. Pretty much every time it's performed, if it's performed at all well, it's always going to make a big effect. And I think that's always the number one sign that a piece is well written and well structured, is the fact that it really hits powerfully with the audience. Now, granted, a rhapsody generally should be a very free kind of structure. You can think about many rhapsodies. The Liszt rhapsodies, Hungarian rhapsodies are probably famous examples. But even for that genre, this piece sprawls quite a bit and seems very loosely structured. The reason why I say it seems loosely structured is because I don't really think that's actually the case. I think Gershwin ended up creating his own unique structure for this piece, partly because he was writing it in a hurry, but really there's some very cunning interior structural planning, and that really accounts for how well the piece works. It's ironic, of course, particularly because this piece has received a lot of criticism over the years for a supposed lack of structure. Even someone like Leonard Bernstein, who played the piece frequently and loved it, had a go at it on these very grounds. And he knew it from when he was a boy, and he has one of the most famous recordings of it. The 1959 recording, when he had just become the music director of the New York Phil, and he played it throughout his career many times. You can see a couple different videos of him performing it live, playing the solo part and conducting the New York Philharmonic Orchestra. It's funny how sometimes we can be a little bit uncertain about even the pieces that we really love. And someone like Bernstein was no exception. He loved popular music, and he loved music that was inspired by that kind of popular stream, but maybe he didn't quite believe in it as strongly as he should have. Who knows? Nonetheless, for many people, the Bernstein recording is the recording of Rhapsody in Blue. And in many ways, I also think it's a wonderful recording. But whether or not it's a successful performance, which might vary depending on the individual listener, you have to admit, I think, once you look at the facts and go back to the basics with this piece, that it's kind of a distortion of Gershwin's original concepts. Bernstein had very, very idiosyncratic ideas about the piece, as he frequently did about the repertoire he performed. You know, he really schmaltzes the piece up. He takes very slow tempi sometimes, super slowly, in fact, at some points. He's also one of the most famous examples of how the slow movement theme, the famous kind of Broadway-like slow movement theme, is usually interpreted in a very different manner than how Gershwin originally intended it. I'll touch on that more later when I go through the piece bit by bit. I'll just talk a little bit about my own memories, though, of the Bernstein recording, since it's such a famous one. I just want to get this out of the way right at the beginning. It was the first recording I ever heard of this piece, and ridiculous as it may sound, I remember at the time I was a little disappointed. You know, if you can imagine that. I think it's because the piece, I'd read about it, and it kind of had it pumped up as being kind of this great meeting place between jazz and classical form, almost like a forerunner of Kapustin or something like that. But when I heard it, I wasn't really impressed by it as a piano piece so much. I thought the piano writing was kind of thin and uninteresting. Now I realize that was partly because of Bernstein's playing. I mean, Bernstein was a good pianist, but he was not necessarily a virtuoso to the same extent that some other pianists might be who played this piece. But nonetheless, I thought the orchestral stuff was gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous, but I didn't quite understand the excitement of the piano part at that time. It was only kind of later on when I heard this piece played by, if I may say, more professional pianists, that I really got super enthusiastic about it, and I realized what a great piece it is. So I think that if you do want to hear more accurately the style of the original, kind of the way it was imagined by Gershwin, which has a lot of drive and rhythmic vitality and punchiness, Of course, you can go back to The Horse's Mouth. You can listen to either one of Gershwin's 2 original recordings. He made one in 1924 and also one in 1927 with Paul Whiteman's band. There are also later recordings by Oscar Levant, famously a friend of Gershwin's and a fantastic pianist. The redoubtable Earl Wild has a great recording with the Boston Pops. And also George Bullitt has a very interesting video performance on YouTube you can find, which is one of the very last records we have of Paul Whiteman conducting the piece. And Paul Whiteman does some very eccentric things in that particular performance. It's still quite wonderful in its own way, though, and worth listening to. And Bullitt plays the piece like an absolute piano animal. It's great, a great performance. And I think I didn't mention it yet. We've got Paul Whiteman, though, so I should mention that Paul Whiteman and his band was the ensemble that this piece was written for originally. He commissioned it. He commissioned Gershwin to write this piece, supposedly to make a lady out of jazz and to introduce the styles of popular music into a classical music concert. It was at the Aeolian Hall. The Paul Whiteman Band was very, very famous in popular music at the time. They were very popular, very much in vogue. And so Gershwin was very excited about this idea of crossing over into the classical world a little bit and writing something for the concert stage. And this piece is really the start, really, of the direction the latter part of his career would go. He would become more and more ambitious in his compositions for the concert stage, probably culminating in something like Porgy and Bess, which is one of the great American operas of all time. So according to legend, Paul Whiteman brought this idea up to Gershwin, and Gershwin was so excited about it. But he was busy at the time writing some Broadway musicals, and he forgot about it for several months until it was about a month before the performance. So the performance was in February, and he saw a newspaper article announcing his new piece was going to be performed on this concert in January. So that really lit a fire for him to start writing the piece. And most commentators, I think, believe he wrote the piece in just about 3 weeks, starting on around January 7th and ending January 28th. And part of the reason he was able to do this so quickly was because in typical Broadway fashion, he didn't actually orchestrate the first version of this piece. He had the help of Paul Whiteman's band arranger, Freddie Graffet, who himself was quite an interesting composer in kind of a quasi-popular style. But Freddie Graffet was the band orchestrator as well, magnificent arranger and orchestrator. This was, as I kind of mentioned, this was common practice for Broadway composers like Gershwin. Gershwin almost never orchestrated his Broadway musicals. It just wasn't really the thing that was done. It was because of time constraints, because you had to write all these songs, you had to get them performed, you had to figure out if you had to cut some or not for the final run. There was a lot of things that you had to do if you were composing and preparing a Broadway musical, and so these tasks were usually split. That's not to say that Gershwin couldn't orchestrate, because he did orchestrate all of his later concert pieces very successfully. But in this case, it really made sense that Graffet would do the orchestration, because the Whiteman band had a very peculiar sound all its own and a very peculiar makeup of instrumentalists, many of whom doubled on more than one instrument. And so you really needed someone who knew the ins and outs of the group and knew exactly how it worked to do the scoring. To get around the difficulties with the orchestration as well, Gershwin favors the solo piano quite a bit. In fact, there's a lot of piano cadenzas, solo piano cadenzas in this piece. It seems like every other page, the piano is breaking out into its own kind of solo show-off moment, which is really a fun thing, although it is also an indication of how quickly the piece was written. It depends on how you count them. For me, I count 5 cadenzas that are spread out over the course of the piece, which is a lot. You know, most classical concerti have maybe 1 or possibly 2. You might have even 1 in each movement if you have a 3-movement concerto, but even that's pretty rare. And this one, which is ostensibly a 1-movement Rhapsody, has 5. Now, if you're looking at the overall form of this piece, you could easily see that it's kind of a 3-movement outline, but the melodic material is really shared between all the different movements. You do get some unique material for the slow movement, the second movement, which is again used in the last movement, and all the themes from the first movement are mixed in to what we get at the end. So in that sense, probably Gershwin was a little bit inspired by classical models like Schubert's Wanderer Fantasy or the Liszt B minor sonata. In particular, the way he kind of transforms the character of the themes does make me think of Liszt a little bit. It's maybe not quite as extreme or quite as ingenious, but similar kind of idea. So before we get to a step-by-step appraisal of the form and an analysis of the music, let's first talk a little bit about the overall aesthetic characteristics of this piece, because that's something which has always been a little bit confusing, I think, and a little mystifying to me, how the piece is kind of miscategorized. You usually hear it talked about as kind of a jazz classical crossover piece. And Gershwin himself, I think, is usually miscategorized as a jazz musician or kind of an early jazz figure. And there's a very natural reason for that. I mean, Gershwin loved jazz, obviously. He loved what jazz musicians did, and he does sometimes write in a style which is influenced by what they were doing. Probably also it's a little confusing because so many great Gershwin standards have been beloved by jazz musicians, and you can find famous covers by jazz musicians of almost the entire Gershwin repertoire. But if you actually look at what Gershwin was doing himself, if you listen to him playing the piano, for instance, you realize that although his style of piano playing and his style of composition is related to the early jazz musicians, he himself was not a jazz improviser in the true sense of the word. He definitely improvised in kind of a more limited way, but what he did musically owed a lot more to his experience as a Broadway composer than it really did to the true jazz experience of some of those musicians. You know, the real jazz figures are more people like Louis Armstrong or Benny Goodman or Art Tatum, Fats Waller, you know, what have you. The ones who are really into intense improvisation and were really steeped in that kind of language that the early jazz people were using. And in a piece like this too, I mean, it's certainly possible to work improvisation into it if you want to, but it's very thoroughly written out. There's no need to put improvisation into it. There's no obvious breaks for improvisation. And Gershwin himself didn't really add improvisations. Maybe just like a little thing here and there, but there's no real true, no true breaks for that like you would have in a true big band piece, you know, by a true jazz band orchestra. So that's one thing, the lack of improvisation, but also just talking about the musical material. Because we do have things nowadays like Nikolai Kapustin's music where the harmonic and melodic material is sometimes so reminiscent of classic jazz, but the forms are totally classical. So is that what this piece is? Is it really like that? And for myself, I'm really forced to the conclusion that it's not. It's not really a jazz-inspired piece per se. I think Gershwin has other pieces which are much more akin to jazz than this one. But I do think it's very much a blues-inspired piece, as the title suggests. And of course, blues is the foundation for jazz and for a lot of other elements in American popular music. But the blues, I mean, that's really the one element which is consistently sounding throughout the work. And you'll see in my analysis, I identify 3 of the main themes of this piece as being specifically blues themes, although really they all have some kind of blues characteristics to them. But all of these 3 themes really emphasize blue notes in their makeup, in their construction, whether that's kind of like a lowered 7th or getting a minor 3rd mixed into kind of a major key context. That sort of sound, which is so characteristic of the blues, is always there. You don't really get the kind of closed 12-bar blues form so much, but you do. I mean, the themes are all a little bit more open-ended, allowing for development and for use in a large-scale work, in the context of a large-scale work, but you do really get the sound, the kind of musical sound of the blues scale. And so even the theme, which is kind of a contrasting theme, which I've called the scherzando theme, is oftentimes heard in the context of very, very bluesy harmonies. So even the themes which are not so obviously blues-inspired kind of get bluesified at some point, you know, during the course of the work. And there's only one major theme in the piece which is more or less free of blues influence for the most part, at least obvious blues influence, and that's the famous slow theme, what I've called the slow movement, quote unquote slow movement. And that's totally Broadway, that theme. It's this one, in case you don't remember what I'm talking about, it's this theme. So that really is just classic Broadway material. You could imagine it being in any one of the Gershwin revues that he was so famous for throughout his career and which made him his fortune. And that was his native ground. You know, he started out as a great Broadway composer. He never completely left that behind, even as he became more and more interested in writing concert music and ended up writing things like Porgy and Bess. Nonetheless, his final work was on the film Shall We Dance? A Fred Astaire classic with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers, which is full of just, quintessential Broadway material. So that's really how I see this piece. It's not so much a meeting place of jazz and classical. It's more blues and Broadway meeting and being digested into a classical form of sorts. And there's other popular dances kind of thrown in for good measure in the form. So the only real thing that is specifically jazz about this piece is that it was written for a jazz band instrumentation originally. And even the Paul Whiteman band wasn't your average jazz band. They also had less emphasis on improvisation. So they were a little bit more on the popular side of things, even though they were very popular, certainly. And so once you know exactly what this piece is really about, it's super fun and super nostalgic and super wonderful, and I just can't get enough of it. So I really got just infected with the bug, the Gershwin bug, all over again as I worked on this concerto, which I've heard so many times since my childhood, and I just want to talk about how brilliant it is. So here we go. Let's start to look at the structure of this piece. So as I mentioned, there's kind of this 3-movement outline with the themes kind of shared between the movements. So vaguely similar to a classical concerto in 3 movements. We even get an opening kind of tutti section with the orchestra alone, which is very common in a classical concerto like a Mozart concerto. And so far as that is there, that's kind of similar to the classical concerto model. But really, if you look at the overall form of this piece, it's more closely related to works in variation form. I think that's kind of the main influence, really. And in particular, the idea of double variation form is one that I think is at work here. So double variations are very rare. And so I felt like I should probably give a little bit of a synopsis on what that even means. Because I think we all probably know what a regular variation piece is like. You have a theme, and then you follow it with variations where you vary the theme. And there's a series of variations, and maybe you have the theme again at the end. That's kind of the idea, right? So in a double variation, you have 2 themes, and they're contrasting, almost always. They're usually stated one after the other, and then you get variations on those 2 themes, again, usually one after the other. So a famous example of that is Haydn's F minor variations for solo piano, which is a late piece of Haydn's, very experimental and unusual. That's probably why it was a double variation form. Not many other composers tried it, but Haydn basically tried everything, so there it is. So maybe that idea was the inspiration for Gershwin and how he ended up structuring Rhapsody in Blue. He was working under white-hot inspiration, and so everything was probably kind of just coming out on instinct to a certain degree. But what happens if you look carefully at the structure is that we get one theme sometimes, and then maybe another theme, and then Gershwin will oftentimes circle back and vary the previous theme, and then maybe we get another new theme, and then another variation on the second theme, and it's this kind of like interweaving of material with constant callbacks to earlier material that is then varied in some kind of interesting way, or the character is changed in some kind of interesting way. And there's nothing pedagogical or formal about the way it sounds, because it's all very freely worked out, and there's always these kind of free improvised sounding transitions and segues. But if you really look closely, you can hear this kind of variation thing happening throughout at least the first movement of the piece. And the first movement is really the longest part. That's maybe 10 minutes out of a 16 or 17 minute piece before we get to the Broadway tune. So now we go to the first theme, what I've called Blues Theme number 1. And this starts, of course, with one of the most famous openings in all music, the glissando and the clarinet. It starts as a B-flat major scale and turns into a glissando. That's not in Gershwin's original score, by the way. The original 2-piano score, which we have here, Gershwin just wrote a scale in his original score. The glissando was an invention of the clarinetist from the Whiteman band who was at the premiere performance, Ross Gorman, which apparently he tried it out in rehearsal, and Gershwin was absolutely full on for it. So I kind of like that, by the way. I like that some of the most quintessential parts of this piece came from other people besides Gershwin. There's kind of a nice melting pot of ideas, a kind of an amalgamation of ideas and contributions from many sources. Graffet's orchestration, the unusual instruments in Whiteman's band, the individual ideas from someone like Gorman. It's kind of all comes into this kind of egalitarian feeling about music, which I think is kind of nice. Maybe that's the American ideal of some kind of melting pot with lots of cooperation. However, so it's hard to do on the piano. I tried to approximate it though, and this is what I did. So at this point, it's kind of important because we get a little hint of what I call blues theme number 2. Just a little hint of it, though. We don't get the whole thing developed, but it's in this case, it's in the piano left hand. So a little hint of blues theme number 2, but that's not what we're developing yet. The orchestra then immediately goes back to blues theme number 1. Now the first entrance of the solo pianist is going to be on what I call the scherzando theme. So the scherzando theme is not always in a scherzo mood, but it frequently is. But when the pianist first enters it, it has a little bit more of a bluesy kind of sound to it. But this idea is going to be coming back repeatedly. It's not developed quite as much as the other ideas, but it comes back repeatedly at kind of crossroads, at moments where we're moving from section to section. So you could almost imagine it, if you're imagining a kind of program, that the scherzando theme is maybe the protagonist of the story, making his way through this musical setting of 1920s New York. Now we get the scherzando theme actually in this very kind of hurried, busy kind of sound. And wouldn't you know it, this is also the first piano cadenza, piano solo cadenza, right at the beginning of the piece. Maybe that's a little reminiscent of things like the Tchaikovsky Piano Concerto number 1, or some other works that open with piano cadenzas like that, the Emperor Concerto by Beethoven maybe. But whatever the case, we get this virtuoso cadenza with some ideas that don't really come back later. They only are in this first opening section. then introduced by that scale, we get the piano solo giving the first blues theme. And we've already modulated by a half step down, so we're in A major instead of B flat major. It's only the first of several fun modulations we're going to be making in this piece. And the piano is now answered by the orchestra with the scherzando theme. The piano just accompanies them. So it's kind of interesting that the parts are switching places like this, because that's another theme that's going to be with us throughout the piece. That an idea introduced by one of the protagonists, either the soloist or the orchestra, is going to switch to the other to be varied or developed in some way. And so now we're already on to our second big cadenza, or if you count it as a continuation of the first, then it's just a super long cadenza with a little orchestral break in the middle. But this second cadenza starts with that scherzando motive again, but developed and kind of building up to a fast climax. And then we get that same repeated chord thing that we had before that comes up to a big climax before the orchestra comes in. And we're not going to hear that idea we just heard again, but now the orchestra comes in on the first blues theme, but with the character completely changed. Now we get in this kind of big, pompous kind of setting, and the scherzando theme is still kind of tucked in there as an answer in the orchestra. So you can hear both ideas are really combined together into one theme. So again, kind of reminiscent of something like the Liszt Sonata. The character of the themes is changed, and we've kind of combined the ideas together. So did you hear that last little transition passage? Let's hear it one more time. This is something which is new, seemingly, right? We haven't had a transition like this yet. Actually not. This was in the cadenza right before this. Gershwin already introduced this. So it's an example of how closely Gershwin is tying the ideas together and kind of dovetailing everything so that we're always calling back to something that we've heard before to help keep us on track and keep the form moving forward in a good direction. So that was the version from the piano cadenza, and then that becomes this transition passage in the full orchestra. So after this, we get one of the few times when Gershwin does have a theme, which never comes back again. We had that at the end of the cadenza with that one passage with the repeated chords, which isn't going to really come back. And now we get another novelty theme, if you will, which is used mainly to just heat up the energy of the piece and get us ready for our next main musical statement. Now at this point, we get the blues theme number 2 coming back. And just to remind you, it sounded like this in the opening, but we haven't heard it since then. it comes back in kind of a surprising way, kind of an oblique way. You barely notice that we have a new theme appearing because it just suddenly jumps out after we've had all these arpeggios and this previous kind of Latin dance motive going on. So it's a little sped up, but it is the same little snippet of theme that we heard at the beginning. So now the orchestra is going to take it over, and we're going to get a big statement and a completion of this theme. So it was kind of just like a little fragment that was open-ended before, and the orchestra is going to provide a full version of the theme now. And worth noting, as we listen to this, even though this is the statement of Blues Theme number 2, Blues Theme number 1 has a little snippet from it, which is worked in. So you'll hear that little bit, the little triplet idea that's right there, that's worked in from Blues Theme number 1. So again, Gershwin's kind of combining the ideas together as he goes forward, developing them and fully bringing them to their full forms. So he is carefully dovetailing all the sections so that this piece will hold together and make sense as we wander through all these different key areas. And now we're in C major. So we were in B flat, A major, and now C major. This transition is really, really funny sounding, and it is basically new, but we're going to get stuff related to this kind of chromatic transition here at the end. That's going to come back repeatedly whenever we're transitioning from one section to another. So that's another thing that kind of creates a little aural hook that kind of reminds us of something that we've heard before, and it's going to help connect things together in a logical way. Now, without really any preparation, we're going to launch right into a totally new theme, which is going to be an important theme as we go forward. This is what I call Blues Theme number 3. This still has all the same kind of hallmark blue notes that we've come to expect so far with this melodic material. Emphasis on flat 7, flat 3, in a major key, and all that kind of stuff. And notice right now, it's in the orchestra. See the little sly chromatic transition there I marked? Same thing coming back. It's just in the opposite direction now, but it's the same idea. And surprise, surprise, we're going to get another cadenza now. This is the third cadenza. And the piano's going to develop that little chromatic transition that I was talking about. And we're going to go into a variation on Blues Theme number 2, right? So Blues Theme number 2 was this one. Which we just heard fully stated for the first time by the orchestra. So now we're going to get a variant on that full version, but in the piano solo, and it's going to have a very different kind of character, a little bit more witty and humorous and kind of sly all the way through. The Gershwin's definitely not just stringing together nice tunes, he's interlocking melodic material with variations from previous motives as he introduces new ones. It's a very unpredictable and a little bit of a dizzy kind of form, but it actually works. Everything holds together because we hear these ideas come back again and again. is also kind of harmonic cohesion underlying all this freewheeling but closely dovetailed melodic construction. This third cadenza is also finding its way back to A major. So in the little transition we have coming up next, we're going to end up in the key of A major. So as you might recall, that's where we started out with the piano's first statement of blues theme number 1. That was in the key of A major. And when the orchestra had its full big statement of blues theme number 1, when it was really loud and kind of driving, that was also A major. So we're kind of have this little callbacks that are happening with the tonal areas as well, kind of helping to hold things together. So it's a kind of continuity within diversity, because we have a new theme, a variation on a thematic idea, but it's in this familiar key. You're not necessarily going to be aware of that unless you have perfect pitch, but I think instinctively you probably are aware that we're in the same place again. So after this variation has run its course, we get the first moment that could really be called a recapitulation of sorts, where we really get something that sounds almost literally the same. So if you remember, we had this big moment from the opening when the piano first entered. And that's what Gershwin recaps now, in a different key and for the piano alone. It turns out this is just a prelude for another variation though. This time we get a variation on blues theme number 1. So we've actually had statement of blues theme number 3, a variation on blues theme number 2, and now a variation on blues theme number 1. So it's kind of interesting that he goes in order through the themes and then backwards through variations on them as well. It's really fun. And this variation is an extremely funny one. Gershwin's written this really cool and kind of tricky figuration for the right hand in 16th notes with these little grace notes added in. It's actually quite difficult to play. I'd say most of this piece is only moderate technical difficulty, but there's one or two passages which are quite hard, and this is one of them. Now the band has the tune, and they're doing something really kind of quirky and funny with it as well. So surprise, surprise, we're in another piano cadenza at this point. It's funny how many of them there actually are. This is a wild take on the ending phrase of blues theme number 1. So this little thing at the end of blues theme number 1. Now it's time for the piano to take up blues theme number 3 and do a variation on what we heard before when the orchestra first gave us that. And now it's all rewritten, and the piano goes through it a couple times, and it all points for maximum piano virtuosity. There's all kinds of fun stuff, like the piano has to have these leaps in the left hand, which are quite dangerous. No matter how good a pianist you are, you're likely to miss them once in a while, and I think that's part of the point. It's supposed to be kind of risky and fun. And now pure Broadway. if you're a fan of this piece and you've heard a lot of other recordings of it, you'll probably notice that I play this theme a bit differently than how it's usually done. Usually people play it a bit slower like this. And then they double time once they get to this next passage in eighth notes. So that's the way that Bernstein does it, but he certainly wasn't the first person to do it that way. I think Ormandy does it in the Levant recording as well, if I remember correctly. Whiteman does it on some of his recordings in some places. Pretty much everybody who's done it more recently, I think. But it's not the way Gershwin played it himself, though. He played it more in this way where it sounds like it's in cut time, where you're really feeling 2 beats for the bar, and then there's kind of the breaks put on when you get to the place with the eighth notes. So the way I played it for you the first time. Like it the original way also, and it's closer to what you end up doing when the piano takes over this theme and there's the piano solo version. Having said all that, I really don't mind the slower version though. I'm sure if you're a purist you'll say, oh no, it's not what Gershwin intended, you shouldn't do that, but true though that is, I think the slower version can be extraordinarily beautiful, just the time that it gives you to kind of relish the melody. So I can't find it in my heart to say that it's wrong or that you shouldn't do it. I don't think either version really detracts from the brilliance of the melody. I think for most people, they're not even going to care. They're just going to be loving this melody, which is so gorgeous. But I have to say, though, going back to Bernstein and his famous recording, he does this part so well with the New York Phil. One of those video performances I remember in particular was just so gorgeous in this part. So even if it's not Gershwin's original idea, I like it. It does work very well. But in this recording, I did the original way. So on the topic of dovetailing too, at the end of this beautiful melody, in the piano solo part of it, Gershwin includes a throwback to those left-hand jumps that we had just before in the third piano cadenza. So you remember that was this part. He brings it back here. And it's just a wonderfully humorous touch in the middle of such a beautiful, touching melody. But it somehow really works. It's like a little twinkle in the eye at this point. So that's what I would call the slow movement of the Rhapsody in Blue, if you want to divide it into movements. And now we're ready for the finale. And similarly to the finale in the Concerto in F, we get a toccata kind of thing at this point. It's a toccata with a very punchy, syncopated rhythm. Again, a little bit of a Latin American influence maybe to the sound. another one of those parts that's really hard to play, much harder than it sounds, to get the repetitions to sound right and to get the right hand parts so that it all fits together correctly. It's quite difficult. Required a lot of practice. It was actually the last thing I recorded in this project. I had to go back and do this part again and again and again until I got it. This is one of the few places, again, where Gershwin has a standalone theme, too. This idea doesn't really appear anywhere else. Cole Anderson jumping in here from the editing floor, I realized I completely missed a very important rhythmical connection between this toccata theme and the accents that you see in the piano cadenza number 2, and also, of course, by extension at the end of this piece when that cadenza is repeated, more or less. So the pattern of accents here in the second cadenza are exactly the same as the accents we get in this toccata theme. So another little thing that I'd never even realized before, but it's an underlying rhythmic connection between this motive and things we've heard before, and we'll hear again. We're going to hear it one more time with the orchestra accompanying. The orchestra plays the Broadway theme, though, but in a fast, kind of urgent version. So again, transformation of themes, a little bit of a nod to Liszt, perhaps. That E-flat dominant 11 chord, that's really a fun moment. It's better in the orchestra because then you hear the brass and everything just like going crazy at that moment. So now continuing with Gershwin's theme of interlocking variations and kind of dovetailing his ideas, now we go back to the second cadenza from the very beginning of the piece where Gershwin kind of developed the scherzando idea, and he reuses this cadenza, but now it's accompanied by the orchestra. But wonderfully enough, it starts in the same key, so it really is almost like a little recapitulation of sorts to bring us back around to where we started and make everything feel like it's coming full circle. And this also fits the way the scherzando theme has kind of been a connector between ideas up till now, kind of like the protagonist in the story, kind of coming back again and again. Good, and now to finish up our kind of recapitulation of ideas, we're going to get blues theme number 2 and number 1 in reverse order in a big triumphant version with the pianist accompanied by the orchestra. So hopefully that doesn't make you think of United Airlines. Hopefully instead it fills you with a lot of joy and pleasure to hear that piece. And as you're listening to the entire performance, I have my complete performance coming up here in a moment. I hope that you will agree with me that we can forever put to rest the notion that Gershwin wrote this piece in too much of a hurry to give any attention to the form. And you will agree with me in saying without hesitation that Leonard Bernstein was completely wrong when he said, quote, "The Rhapsody is not a composition at all. It's a string of separate paragraphs stuck together with a thin paste of flour and water. Composing is a very different thing from writing tunes, after all." End quote. So given what we just learned about this piece, as we crawled over it very carefully from first part to last, I think we can all agree that's ridiculous. Not true at all. So Sorry. Even someone like Bernstein could be a bit of a snob sometimes. I mean, come on. Even with the music that he loves so much. So I'll stop there now. Coming up in a few moments, as I mentioned, I have my complete uninterrupted performance of the Rhapsody in Blue with my analysis written alongside it. And in case you're wondering about the production of this video, as I have done a few other concerto videos in the past and people kind of wondered how I do it, it is me playing the orchestral part as well. So I overdubbed the solo part above my own playing of the orchestral part to make this recording happen. And to do that, I kind of had to record in sections, bit by bit, and then paste everything together. There's no other way to do it, really. Otherwise, it would be impossible to line everything up. That's how I managed it. I don't do concerti that often, but I'm planning to do more of them now because I have kind of the workflow down for how to do it. It is a lot of work, though, to record first off because you have to record twice as much music, the solo part and the orchestra part, and then the analysis. Of course, they're kind of big pieces generally, concerti, so that does take a little while. But if you have any that you would like to request, feel free. I have ideas for a few concerti that I really, really want to do, including Beethoven 4 and the Grieg Concerto and a few other interesting things, maybe the Scriabin concertos and some other stuff like that. But if you have any requests, please feel free to leave them in the comment section. So it just remains for me to say thank you to my wonderful patrons on Patreon, and please consider supporting the channel through Patreon if you can. It's very greatly appreciated and really helps me immeasurably. So thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you all next week for some more music and conversation.